To Know Where to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and we're going to be talking about safe spaces in Idaho. Now, you might think you know what a safe space is. Maybe you're thinking about it in some kind of an academic setting or something like that. But there are a couple of safe spaces I'm guessing you probably haven't thought about. Libraries being one of them. How about a city where they will actually violate your property rights in order to make your feelings safe? I've got the details coming up.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Know Where to Hide. Twice a week, I have the opportunity to sit down and go over in depth some of the stories that legacy media just can't quite bring itself to cover in detail. Now, that doesn't mean that I have all the answers. I'm just trying to fill in some of the gaps so that you can make a more informed conclusion on your own. In other words, you don't have to believe a word I say. I'm asking you to think this through for yourself. So what exactly is in the water in North Idaho? Keep in mind, a few months ago, this was the home of the Idahokes, right? This is where the University of Utah women's basketball team was, we were told, assailed with a racial crime, a hate crime, I believe they called it at the time. People in lifted pickups with Confederate flags yelling racial epithets, or so the story went. And after investigation, not only by the Coeur d'Alene Police Department, but also the FBI, yes, it was blown completely out of proportion, and it turned out that the best that they could come up with was a kid, a teenager in a passing car, may have yelled something sexually suggestive and perhaps racially insensitive to one of the members of the University of Utah women's basketball team. Not to say that's the right thing to do, but it was blown out of proportion. I mean, for crying out loud, the Idaho Senate actually held its members there until they passed a resolution condemning this incredible crime and this racial incident. The point being that it was a problem that was being manufactured out of contrived outrage, and when that didn't work, there was another incident where somebody apparently called some kids at a park insensitive names. Well, see, it was racially abusing them, and so there's quite this sense of we have a problem and we've got to fix it. In other words, it's a solution in search of a problem, and so Coeur d'Alene actually just a week or so ago passed a so-called hate speech law, in which they will now punish people for what they consider inappropriate thoughts. I wish I was making this up, but it's they actually believe they can determine what people may rightfully think versus what they may not. Look, nobody is saying that it's right to go around saying rude things to people, but it shouldn't be a crime. And so to try to criminalize that and to appoint the city or municipal authority as someone who's in a position to punish people. Now, I've heard. I don't know that this is true. If this is not true, it still nonetheless seems plausible that if you are in fact convicted of hate speech violation in Coeur d'Alene, you will be sentenced to painting rainbow crosswalks as part of your debt to society. That sounds kind of made up to me, but at the same time, given what was happening during Pride Month in Spokane, just across the border, it can't be out of the realm of possibility. So obviously, there are some people who are very intent on they're going to do some good. They're going to save the world from itself. And apparently Coeur d'Alene has proven to be fertile ground for people with those controlling impulses. So case in point, let me introduce you to a story here that hopefully gets your attention. Coeur d'Alene City Council chases away sadness with a prohibition on private property. Now, this is a little more serious, okay? This is something you can tangibly measure as in, does a person really own their property or not? Well, the Coeur d'Alene City Council has voted to take away property rights from some of its home and business owners because, believe it or not, tearing down old buildings might make some people sad. However, the Coeur d'Alene Press didn't push that headline on its readers, instead offering that the council had voted to protect history. That sounds a lot more noble than denying people their property rights. Now, the Idaho Freedom Foundation reports the council voted 5-1 to put a 182-day moratorium on demolition and moving permits and building permits for significant exterior alterations for buildings, excluding residential, located in the downtown core zoning district and downtown overlay, north side and downtown overlay east side districts, and buildings listed on the National Historic Register. So the stated intention is we want to keep old buildings from being razed to make way for newer ones. Now, it's a noble intention, but it still doesn't absolve people of the fact that that's somebody else's property. Whoever the property owner is really should have the final say. And naturally, the action came with the usual, I support property rights declarations from politicians and bureaucrats, followed by affirmative votes to deny people's property rights. Go figure. It's not what they say, it's what they do. Always watch the actions, don't just listen to their words. Coeur d'Alene and other Idaho local governments don't have this authority to place a general halt on construction and demolition on private property except for a misapplication of Idaho law. And listen to how they're straining to get to this definition so that they can justify it. The state's Local Land Use Planning Act says a moratorium on work can only occur if the local government finds an imminent peril to public health, safety, or welfare. So the obvious plain reading and purpose of the statute was to protect people from imminent physical threats. And the bogus argument the city of Coeur d'Alene has put forward stretches the meaning of the statute to say it applies to mental health, which it obviously does not. It's about, is this going to physically harm somebody? Then maybe they could do that. But what about protecting people's health, their mental health? Here's what the ordinance here said, or at least here's what the act said, the moratorium that they passed. Mental health professionals in the community have cited mental health impacts related to the loss of a historic building. The research on grief and loss has been significant. The loss of historic buildings does not merely constitute an architectural change, but a loss of belonging, a loss of identity. Oh, it's identity, is it? And a loss of rootedness. For many, these buildings hold sentimental value, evoking cherished memories, and their demolition can trigger feelings of grief and displacement. The act of demolishing historic buildings can exacerbate existing mental health issues within the community. I'm guessing there's not a shortage of those based on the actions of these politicians. It fosters a sense of powerlessness and disenfranchisement among residents who feel unheard and undervalued regarding decisions affecting their surroundings. The loss of familiar landmarks can disrupt an individual's sense of place and lead to feelings of isolation and alienation. I mean, the only thing that's missing there is some sad violins playing in the background. But the bottom line is they're tearing down the old savings and loan building, and this makes me sad. Better call on the city to protect me from my feelings. So to put it as simply as possible, and this is as well as it can be said, government exists to protect people's rights, including the right to own property and to do with it as you will. But now the government is being used to keep people safe from sadness. I know it seems like, well, you're being awfully insensitive to those people who might otherwise be, traumatized by changes in the appearance of a building downtown. But look, either you have property rights or you don't. It's kind of like being pregnant. Either you are or you aren't. There's no such thing as, well, you kind of have private property rights, but only under these, circumstances in which nobody's feelings are in danger. What an interesting reading and what an interesting way to go about protecting the community. And you can see that the danger here, there's no limit to where this crusade could take people when there's feelings involved, because, well, feelings are subjective. And what may be perfectly tolerable actually may be reasonable to most people. There may be some sensitive soul who says, oh, I just can't handle that. Nope. Not a proper act of government, and somebody needed to call it out. Thank you to the Idaho Freedom Foundation for doing so. Now, here's another one, and this one goes back to the very first of the month here, when libraries choose smut instead of child literacy. This is from Ronald Nate, who's the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and this has to do with the Donnelly Library. Check this out. Did you hear this nugget of Idaho news? The Donnelly Public Library announced it would go adults only on July 1st. The statement to the press explained the decision. Our size prohibits us from separating our grown-up books to be out of the accessible range of children, Donnelly officials wrote. That's right. Donnelly favors smut for grown-ups over literacy for children. I mean, they make it out like, we've got to carry these things. It's not like we have a choice. So what's really going on? Well, Ron Nate says, in short, Idaho lawmakers passed legislation earlier this year to deal with the very real problem of explicit and smutty materials being made available to children in libraries and schools. House Bill 710, a watered-down version of a much stronger bill, nonetheless passed this year, preventing libraries and schools from doling out materials deemed to be harmful to children. Now, we're not just talking subjective, well, I don't like the sound of that, people dancing, that sounds pretty risky. We're talking pretty deviant behavior. And the point here is the bill isn't what most principled conservatives wanted. In fact, total prohibition on sexually explicit materials is warranted here. and it should be pursued in the 2025 session, says Ron. There's also absolutely no reason taxpayers should be funding the purchase of materials teaching children deviant sexual behaviors. Now, I've shared enough examples of some of the books in question. There is no doubt this is teaching some pretty nasty stuff, again, to young minds. As a grown-up, if that's what you want to avail yourself of, hey, knock yourself out. But not the kids. But Ron points out that's not where we're at. Now we're in a situation where adults who are paid with taxpayer dollars and who should know better are rebelling because conservatives don't want children to be shown deviant and harmful materials in libraries. Pretty plain and simple. If you've read other news or visited social media lately, you might think Idaho's legislative Republicans have declared war on your favorite neighborhood librarian. Or worse, Republicans have set up theocratic book-banning shops inside your community library. Ron says the hyperbole is exhausting, but the narrative peddled by media types and social media warriors couldn't be further from the truth. The bill also grants parents the right to take legal action against a library if librarians distribute harmful materials to children. And the bill protects parental freedom by providing a way for them to grant libraries permission to give obscene materials to their children. In other words, it's not like this is totally inaccessible. It's there, but it's not just free for the taking. So Ron Nate finishes up here by telling us the Donnelly Library is half right in its claim that the bill is hard on them. The smaller facilities require more creative solutions or tougher decisions, but instead of prioritizing children, the librarians have prioritized explicit materials for adults. If we have to choose, we'll choose the explicit ones. They could have easily chosen to make the library a family-friendly place, but they didn't. Instead, they're choosing to buy explicit books and kick the kids out. Now, that's, collective punishment, something that leftists seem to be quite fond of. He says Donnelly might not have the funds to pay legal fees, but it apparently has enough funding and desire to purchase books that shouldn't be given to children under any circumstances. Why do they insist on questionable books instead of some of the billions of virtuous titles available to them? That's a good question. It's a disturbing choice in an era where most of our government institutions have morphed into ideological indoctrination centers, pushing leftist policies on our youngest minds. Government schools, universities, and now libraries have shown their true colors. They're no longer havens for free thought, but instead brainwashing apparati. Beautifully said. You can go to idahofreedom.org if you want to read this in its entirety. Look, I know that people who oppose, smutty material for kids being made available in the library, you're being accused of being a book banner. You're hopelessly, trying to control other people. But just between us, we know that's not the case. You're actually very normal. You're within the mainstream. And frankly, thank you for not losing your sense of direction simply because some shrill activist has tried to hang some label on you. If you don't believe in word magic, it's just so much, noise in the wind, as opposed to, well, if I say you're something, then you magically turn into it. Stand firm, insist on good, accountable government policies, and don't feel like you need to apologize for actually having a sense of what's appropriate versus what isn't. I mean, we have reached the point where people who would look approvingly on naked adults dancing in front of children as part of some pride celebration are the same people who go apocalyptic when adults pray to God. Seems to me that there's a pretty clear line that's being drawn there. One on the side of evil and one that is on the side of good. And maybe we should stop pretending that it's otherwise. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark